Coming up, the waiting game, with Australia now on a timetable to end the tough restrictions. What can we learn from other countries? Plus, the cracks appearing in bilateral relationships. How will COVID-19 shape the new world order? You're watching The Virus. Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Australians have 5 more days to persuade the government to ease social restrictions and to begin the process of reviving the economy. The Prime Minister says there are 15 criteria that must be met and that the nation's already achieved 11 of those. Some states have already moved. The Northern Territory has opened pools and playgrounds and is allowing weddings and funerals to go ahead with no limitations. In Western Australia, groups of 10 people are now allowed to gather indoors as well as outside. If National Cabinet is satisfied that progress is continuing, Scott Morrison will announce on Friday which parts of the shutdown will be lifted.
Of those that remain outstanding, there is one that Australians can do something about, and that is downloading the COVID Safe app. This is a critical issue for National Cabinet when it comes to making decisions next Friday about how restrictions can be eased.
And here's why relief is on the horizon. It's because the national daily case rate remains relatively low. We're keeping below 20 new infections a day, which authorities say is manageable. The national death toll is now 95 and about 80 people are being treated in hospital for COVID-19. Well, it's not just Australia. Across the world, countries and cities are starting to work their way out of these lockdowns, some slowly and some much faster than others. Philip Williams takes a look at a couple of countries that are in a very similar position to Australia right now and a couple of other countries that are just not.
What do Iceland, South Korea and Australia have in common? The answer is in all of these countries, new cases of coronavirus are down to around single digits each day. So what can we learn about how they've handled the pandemic? Let's start with South Korea. It never had a full lockdown. This week, churches reopened and their soccer league kicks off again on Friday.
I go to the office every day, I go for a beer, and it's pretty much a normal life.
The strategy was to start early with testing and to contact trace using data from organisations including the police, credit card and phone companies. There is no app. If you own a phone in South Korea, you'll be tracked.
People do accept that slight intrusion into their life, as a trade-off.
That level of access wasn't ever on the table here, but the question is whether that's the degree of intrusion you need to be effective. On the other side of the world, another island nation has made huge strides using an app more like ours. The Icelandic version is also voluntary, but it's been downloaded by a greater percentage of the people. From tomorrow, all of Iceland's schools and universities will reopen, along with massage parlours, museums and dentists. Public gatherings of up to 50 people will be allowed. That's been possible only because of extensive testing, including people with no symptoms, which is what Australia is also planning.
First and foremost, I think that it has shown us that with a focused effort, with the use of modern science, even an epidemic like this can be contained.
We'll also be watching other countries that are opening up more quickly to see if they've moved too fast. In the US state of Texas, they've just reopened all gyms, cinemas, shopping malls and restaurants this weekend.
I was eager. I saw where it was supposed to open up today, and so because it's gone stir crazy at home.
I woke up and said, it's time to go. I've been waiting for this day.
And one of the hardest hit countries, Italy, is restarting major industries from tomorrow. Museums, libraries and retailers reopen in a fortnight. Perhaps even more significant, diners will be able to return to the city's trattorias from the 1st of June.
In settings where easing is happening stepwise, that can help to give us hopefully some information about which types of measures are most likely to be safe.
Here in Australia, the biggest worry is complacency. A fear that we see these other nations opening up and think, why can't we do that?
The virus hasn't changed and we're susceptible. And in Australia, we're also mindful that we're going into the winter season when most respiratory viruses are more transmissible. We don't understand a lot about this virus and seasonality, but it does make us extra vigilant and aware of the likelihood of those outbreaks occurring.
Every country in the world is, trying to learn from one another and what works and what did not work.
It will take 2 weeks to know whether Texas and Italy have been too bold. It's a delicate balance no one wants to get wrong.
Well, global tensions over the outbreak increased this week. The US is threatening more trade tariffs against China if it's found to have misled the world. Beijing is continuing to lash out against calls for an independent international inquiry. It's accusing Western countries of trying to shift the blame for how they are handling the crisis. Chinese state media are running concerted campaigns to try to discredit foreign governments. The Chinese ambassador to Australia even threatened an economic backlash if the government here continued to push for an inquiry. The Prime Minister, though, is standing firm.
I don't think this is a remarkable suggestion. I think it's a fairly obvious and common sense suggestion.
With respect to Australia, who had the temerity to ask for an investigation. Who in the world wouldn't want an investigation of how this happened?
So those tensions have many wondering what the global power balance will be in the post-coronavirus world. I put some of your questions to Stephen Loosley, a Senior Fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Professor Stan Grant from Charles Sturt University. How seriously should we take China's displeasure at the way Australia is calling for an international investigation into the origins of this coronavirus? It's been a really huge week in terms of that bilateral relationship, hasn't it?
It should be taken seriously, but it ought not to determine our policy, Jeremy. A sovereign country determines its own policy, often in concert with allies and partners and in regional groupings. Now, the fact that Australia has called for an inquiry to determine precisely what happened with the spread and is happening with the spread of the coronavirus is not an outrageous proposition. If we look back to 1920, it would have been absurd if people had suggested there ought not to be a tracing of Spanish flu.
The big difference is China 2020 is not Spain 1920. It is an entirely different proposition to enter into this potentially combative space with a country that is your biggest trading partner. It's not just a question of what Australia does here, but it's how China reacts. We've seen immediately China bristle at this. We've seen the veiled threats about impact on our trade. Their economy has taken an enormous hit because of the impact of coronavirus. Going into the coronavirus scare, its economy was already at its weakest point in 30 years. But at the same time, the West is now hit economically. It's weakened us as well. It's a perfect storm. It's an authoritarian challenge at a time when democracy was in retreat around the world, when there was declining freedom around the world, where there was a rise of nationalism and a vulnerability and unpredictability to the geopolitical landscape.
A lot of questions have been raised about the WHO's slow response in labelling this a pandemic and its favourable treatment of China. Where does that leave us in terms of other global bodies that can effectively police and manage not just the outbreak on the ground, but the relationships that it puts under strain as a result?
It's a good question, Jeremy, and frankly, the WHO is irreplaceable at a global level. You have other bodies doing some very valuable things, but they're mostly to be found in the philanthropic, not-for-profit sector. Médecins Sans Frontières, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the George Institute, and so on, all doing really outstanding things in the health area, but you really need the WHO as a coordinating body.
Stephen Loosley and Stan Grant there. There's a lot more from that Q&A session. You can check out the full 40-minute conversation on the ABC News YouTube and Facebook channels. Keep the questions coming in. We'll hold another live stream next Friday at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Time. Make sure you join us then. For now, stay safe. Goodbye.